Professor Hafez, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this podcast. We are very glad to have you here, and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and thanks for having me. It's an honor for me to be here with you today.
Jazakallah. I let Rayan start by the reminder of the public policy of Emmanuel Macron since 2018.
You certainly know it, but basically, since February 2018, the French government started a very specific public policy, which obviously targets Muslims and basically the entire Muslim civil society. And since February 2018, the policy, which is entitled Systematic Obstruction, led to the closure of more than 600 mosques, Islamic schools, any business run by Muslims, but also to the administrative investigation of more than 24,000 of these establishments. And it also led to the seizure of 45 million euros from an already impoverished Muslim community, weakened by decades, basically, of institutional bigotry. And what's interesting is that not only that, which is basically enormous, but at the same time, the anti-separatism law was adopted in order to intensify the systematic obstruction, in order to ease the implementation of this public policy. And this is not just a mere analysis or just an interpretation. You can actually find what I'm saying in an official document drafted by the Prime Minister Jean Castex. It's a public circular, and in that document, he states that the systematic obstruction is soon to be reinforced by the new dispositions of the anti-separatism bill. So that's basically the context we are in. In 2018, it was still about radicalization, but that notion was very quickly replaced by Islamism, communitarian withdrawal, and then obviously it was definitively replaced by the notion of separatism.
Okay, thank you, Rayan. I will start by defining Islamophobia according the coordination against separatism law. So Islamophobia, as we define it, it's indeed an obstacle to the construction, development, and liberation of the Muslim community. In France, this obstacle seeks to suppress all forms of Muslim subjectivity regarding faith and worship, culture, and political expression. Islamophobia in France is present at all the levels of the society, at the government level, police and judiciary level. We agree to say that Islamophobia today is a consensus. For a couple of years now, there has been a radicalization of French Islamophobia, in the sense that before 2015, the government policy aimed to fight against a certain group of people deemed radicalized, while today radicalization terminology has been dropped in order to speak instead about separatism. And therefore, today, every Muslim is considered as an enemy from within, and every non-Muslim exposing Islamophobia as their associate. The law now duly institutionalizes the old arbitrary emergency policy measures. With the anti-separatism law, French states creates a group subjected to a truly derogatory regime based on suspicion, control, intimidation, and repression. The anti-separatism law institutionalizes and legalizes Islamophobia. This law brings Muslims in France, and in particular, French Muslims of immigrant background or Muslim immigrants, back to the status that their ancestors experienced during French colonization, since this law restricts the ability of Muslim minority and all Islamic organizations to act. This means that this law reduces their access to many rights. Indeed, a number of activities will be more difficult to handle by Muslims or even impossible for Muslims in France. So the aim of this law is to dismantle all visible Muslims' religious expression or political expression. It's a law which increases the authoritarianism of the state, which will be able to legally use its entire administrative, political, and juridical arsenal against any form of organization of worship and association of Muslims. Clearly, this law is a political, economic, and social apartheid for Muslims living in France. Immediately after the Confluence attack in November 2020, the Home Office Minister announced the dissolutions of associations and closure of mosques, underlining that the fear will change sides. However, the state did not attack terrorist organizations or terrorists directly. French government attacked Muslims. When the Home Office Minister made this statement, he was actually threatening the Muslim community. And few days after this statement, the CCIF and Baraka City were dissolved. The Pantin Mosque was closed and other Muslim organizations were closed. Since November 2020, 99 mosques suspected of separatism have been checked. 99 mosques suspected of separatism. 21 mosques closed and 6 other mosques are in the process of being closed. Not to mention the dissolution of 3 Muslim associations, the CCIF, Baraka City, and the Coordination Against Racism and Islamophobia.
Yeah, so we're going to start with the questions, inshallah. So firstly, Dr. Hafez, can you please describe the report's findings and basically what is it teaching us about European and French Islamophobia?
Well, first of all, just for the context, we've been doing this European Islamophobia report now for 6 years. It's the 6th report that has been published. It's an annual project since 2015. And the main reason why we did that was basically to provide civil society and anti-racist organizations with data on Islamophobia so they are able to make their case when they want to change something. Because back in 2014, when we first came up with that idea, there was still this wide kind of feeling, you know, what is Islamophobia really all about, and do we have any facts? And so we really wanted to be a kind of a helping hand in this process for civil society organizations and justice movements to push for their anti-racist agenda. So for the 2020 report, the reason why we put Macron there was basically because we felt that this level of state Islamophobia is really has reached a tipping point. And you just mentioned it. I mean, numbers of mosques, anti-racist organizations, aid organizations being closed down, that is something new, right? This has not been the case like 5 years ago. And now it is centrist institutions, centrist governments, which are pushing for that kind of legislation, which are implementing these kinds of measures. And that is something new. And again, France is not the only case. There are also other countries, Austria, where I come from, and other countries which are pushing for these kinds of measures to become the new normal. And I think what we are observing here is, you spoke about in 2018 when there was this all of this talk about radicalization. The idea really a few years ago was, especially when ISIS as a phenomenon came up, there was this idea of we have to push back against radicalization and militancy. And what we have been witnessing the last few years is widening this notion of fighting extremism, violent extremism, and fighting radicalization. This has shifted to fighting non-violent extremism. So basically what we are witnessing is that these state authorities do not go only against those forces who are taking to the arms, who are using violence as a means to implement their goals, but rather they are widening that to also include any kind of non-violent form of what they would call extremism. So basically, then we see it goes after mosque institutions or anti-racist institutions in the alleged fight against what they call extremism. And I think this is something, it is part and parcel of this project of fighting extremism, right? But at the very same time, it really shows how much the state actually goes against common Muslimness. And I think the French case shows us on one side, as it has been for the last 25 years, that it goes against Muslim visibility, and that is due to its history of secularism. But then again, it shows us that it's going after any kind of political opposition. This is what we could see, not only with going after the Muslim civil society, but also going against what it called Islamo-Gushism, Islamo-leftism, which is fighting what it called any kind of critical scholarship that tries to use critical race theory or post-colonial studies in order to criticize the French state and its handling of the Muslim question. And that also translates into fighting what we could see Muslim independent agency. And the law against separatism is just a very good case in point, because what we could see here is something that we had already witnessed in countries like Austria, the regulation that Muslim institutions should not be financed from outside of France. All of this speaks to this idea of trying to domesticate Islam in a French way. So basically to create a domestic form of French Islam that is disciplined by the French state authorities. It is made, and what they want to create is basically a French Islam that submits to the French will of those in power. That is not has not a unique independent political agency to criticize the French government, but rather it is one that is silent upon oppression, that submits to the French will of what Islam should look like, and that has no independent political agency. And I think this is really the project that is at stake currently as we can see it in France.
So a few minutes ago, you explained why you choose a picture of Emmanuel Macron as the front cover of the report. Does this mean that for the researchers gathered, France constitutes the forefront of Islamophobia in the West and therefore a danger for the entire Muslim community in Europe?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's the editors who chose this cover page. So it's the responsibility lies solely on me and Enes, the co-editor, Enes Barakli, the co-editor of the report. I don't want to put any blame on any of the other authors, but definitely, I think what was important for us, because obviously 2020 was the year of the pandemic, right? So we could easily have chosen the pandemic, the virus, as also something that has really changed the face of Islamophobia, going more to the digital sphere. But we did not do so. Why? Because we thought really what happened in France was so important to be covered, because it is in a way a tipping point. Because what we are witnessing in these days is that the problem with the French figure of Macron is that he also represents not the blatant far right. He represents what in many European circles, he is kind of the liberal guy, the neocon. Well, the coverage of a lot of US media has maybe helped in order to also problematize some of the aspects which Macron is pushing for, especially when it goes against critical scholarship. But this aspect, this dimension of being against the organized Muslim civil society is something that is widely not really recognized. And this is what we wanted to highlight, in really to give it some emphasis in order to people to be aware that there is a problem there, and let's talk about it. So that is, I think, one important aspect to it. The other is, obviously, a lot of media also speaks about Macron kind of co-opting the anti-Muslim rhetoric of, in the past, Le Pen, and currently more Zemmour. But what we really want to show with the report and the findings of the report is also that this is not only about an electoral gain. I mean, this is one important dimension to it, absolutely, and I agree with the commentators, the political commentators, on the importance of this anti-Muslim rhetoric in shortly before the election. But I think that there is one other strategic dimension to all of these political legislations, to these legislations and political measures, which is the longer perspective, the long-term strategy behind these legislations, which is, in my opinion, that the French political elite sees in Muslims a long-term problem. They know there is around, let's say, 8% of an estimation of the whole population in France being Muslim. And the projection is that this is going to increase within the next 20, 30 years to become maybe 20 to 30% of the whole population. So in case that happens, the question is like, what is the role of Muslims within those 3 decades to come? And there is obviously the perception that given their increase in number, we have to handle them. So there is either the possibility to let them do whatever they want to do, but especially in the French understanding of republicanism and so-called égalité, which is more of a sameness and not allowing any kind of difference to be part of the public sphere, the fear is that if they do so, that will change what the common perception of and conception of Frenchness is. So the idea is, if we create this French notion of Islam, this is how we can secure this idea of égalité. And I think this is really what is at stake for the French case. And in different ways, it is also what is at stake for other cases like the Austrian case, where with the Islam Act of 2015, they had already implemented the ban of foreign funding and the idea of to create this Austrian notion of Islam. By that meaning, actually more what the colonial empire meant when it said we want to have a modern version of French Islam, trying to disconnect Muslims from their global community, and by that do something which is very antithetical to any other church or denomination, because every church, the Catholic Church is an international one. The Protestants are a global community, right? And as much as this is the case, it's also with the Muslims. But what they fear with the Muslims is that this kind of global connectedness undermines the French nation state. And this is, I think, what is really at stake here, what we can see, and what Macron is actually looking at. And again, I would argue this is not so much a Macron project only. It's a French project that is much older than Macron has been in power.
Very interesting what you are saying here, Professor Hafez. Really, really interesting. So basically, the researchers who worked on the report 2020, do they conclude just like us that the radicalization of French Islamophobia tends to become a tool for the de-Islamization of the Muslim minority in France through the control of their beings, their worship, and their beliefs?
Well, I think that's at least my conclusion, even not maybe the conclusion of the authors of the report, because, again, the report is very much about trying to basically show what happened from January 1st to 31st of December within 1 year. And I think what I added here is much of more of a theoretical kind of trying to contextualize this, which with something that you won't necessarily find even in the report. the way it is drafted, because this is not the way how we present it to the wider audience. But yes, I think you are right in the way you put it. I think this is really what is at stake, trying to discipline the Muslim subject, assuming that it is a security threat to the nation state, to the French society. And this is really how people bargain about regarding this issue within the French political elite. That's the way how I would put it, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for responding to my question, Professor Hafez. And now I let my my brother Rayan from Cage to ask the other questions.
Thank you so much. So basically, we are witnessing the rise and basically the establishment of a true Islamophobic consensus in France, and which you can basically quite easily witness in the realm of medias, politics, the government, the administration, but also in the legal system as well. Can we say that this consensus is slowly starting to become a global consensus, a global Islamophobic consensus, because of the influence of the French government? And if such an Islamophobic consensus becomes global, shouldn't the Muslim minorities in the world unite and in order to oppose such a global consensus?
Well, that's an interesting question, because first of all, I think, I mean, we got to be very clear about the fact, these French policies that are in place, again, they are not uniquely French. There are other countries in Europe which basically use very similar measures. And first and foremost, I think the strongest ally in that is the Austrian government. But then there is a structural question that is very much related to that, which is, I think the structural underpinning of this is very much a church-state relationship or religion-state relationship that you can find in a lot of countries, especially in the Muslim world, right? Because the way how the state conceives religious structures is by seeing it as basically the long arm of state authorities. And that is something which is very typical to especially the post-colonial era in what some people would call the Muslim world. Let's call it Muslim majority societies. A lot of institutions, religious ministries, departments of religious affairs, or Waqf systems, as they call it in those countries, are very much an aiding institution to the state. So I think structurally speaking, you have this problem, especially in the Muslim world, rather than you have it in Western countries, because at least theoretically speaking, let's say take the example of Austria, there is this idea of separation and secularity, which is a separation of state authority and the sphere of religious institutions, which should ideally help in not having these problems. Okay? The problem with the Muslim issue is that in a lot of European countries in these days, this separation is actually circumvented by trying to approach the Muslim question through going or approaching the Muslim issue through the Ministry of Interior. So it is not anymore, let's say, the Department of Religious Affairs that is in charge of dealing with the Muslim institutions, but rather it is the Ministry of Interior that is approaching Muslim issues through the lens of security. While at the very same time, let's say, the Catholic Church is approached through the Ministry of Religious Affairs or the Ministry of Cultural Affairs, as it is in most countries in Western Europe where you have this kind of state-church relationship. So what we find is that the system of separation, which could actually be a help for Muslims, is circumvented in those Western European nation states, while in the Muslim world, or let's say the Muslim majority societies, where you have the state authorities being in charge of religion, that's how they use religion for their own sake. Therefore, I don't know who is the ally here anymore, even potentially speaking, who could be. So maybe only those would problematize this who do not want Islam to be used for political ends. But again, there is a wider problem that we have to discuss then. And I think those countries who could really speak out for you are rather those countries where separation is really practiced. And the freedom of religion goes alongside other freedoms, like the freedom of association, the freedom of speech, and other freedoms. But potentially, I would say it becomes very complicated. And I don't know if countries and state institutions could be of any help, where structurally speaking, the problem could potentially occur at any time.
Thank you so much for your answer, Dr. Hafez. I don't know, Maria, if you have maybe other questions in mind.
I mean, maybe just to give just one more thought to that, I think the way how this issue should be problematized maybe is, yes, international kind of comprehending this problem and also tackling this problem on an international scale. But I think the way how to problematize this is really much more from the perspective of this being a problem of racism, and approaching this from a civil liberties perspective. And I think the institutions that should problematize that are primarily institutions that or movements or organizations that are problematizing issues of race, issues of class, and issues of freedoms. And because I think this is really the perspective that people should have in problematizing these crackdowns that we have been witnessing throughout the last few years.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your precise answer, and inshallah we'll take some inspiration in order to tackle the issues that we are facing right now.
So why a very interesting report and serious report, such the 2020 report, did not bring more reaction from the media, the intellectual, the NGOs or associations, or either politicians or governments brings any reaction?
Well, I mean, first you would have to ask those who did not react, right? But I think, I mean, in general, I can tell it like from my own experiences. I think, as long as I would criticize Islamophobia on the level of far-right institutions, you would have a lot of clapping hands and people who congratulate you, and you would even get awards and stuff like that. And I think once you really have you're really criticizing those power structures and the center of power, then it's obvious that a lot of people will fear standing aside of you, supporting this kind of work, because obviously you're not dealing anymore with the far right still is a marginal. I mean, maybe its discourse is hegemonic, has become hegemonic when it comes to Islam and Muslims and the scapegoating of this religion and religious group. But in terms of the power they are having, it's still marginal. It's not those who are filling the bureaucrats of all of the state authorities, right? So therefore, it is very clear why people would rather be silent about those findings. But I also believe that we will be successful over time because it becomes more obvious. I remember when the murder of Samuel Paty happened, and I gave some interviews, international media asked me, but when you criticize the raiding of the mosques, etc., there must be a reason for that, right? And that's the general European take on state, the acting of the state authorities, right? There is always this trust that you have that you put in the state authorities. Rather, in the Anglo-Saxon world, you're much more critical of what the state is doing in terms of minorities, especially, and therefore. That is something I think over time we will see because the justice system will speak more. The people who are marginalized, when they come out and speak about the injustices that they have gone through, people will see clearer what has happened and what injustices they have been witnessing. So therefore, I do think no matter how much this is appreciated at this point of time, over time, it will be recognized. And the more people speak about it, the more awareness that is created, the more I think we will also be able to work against these injustices that we have been witnessing and that we're living through, and a lot of Muslims are living through. And again, scholars, critical scholars have been witnessing with all this anti-Gushism discourse. So I think we also have to be patient, and we have to keep on doing the good work that we're doing, all of you, and us included, so that we see change coming.
Thank you very much, Professor Hafez, and thank you for this for this sentence that brings joy and we can see that we are not fighting for nothing. So thanks a lot.